Good morning, everyone. My name is Haroon Mohel, and across from me, so to speak, is Joey Taylor. We're the co hosts of Avenue M. We're here for our 15th episode and second live episode. Just a couple weeks back, we had a beautiful conversation about Ramadan and Lent and what fasting and restraint and sacrifice mean in our faith traditions. We liked it so much that we wanted to do it again, but the topic today is a harder one, a more difficult one, and a more urgent one. We're here to talk about Iran and the events of the last few days, what they mean, how we might respond, how we might make sense of them, and where we go from here. So I'm going to kick it over to Joey to start what I hope is a really honest, searching conversation that gives background as well as direction. So, Joey, how you
Yeah,
doing?
yeah, I'm doing great, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you. It's interesting when anything happens geopolitically in the world. The first person I want to talk to is you to get your input on what's going on and your analysis on how you think things will develop from here. So maybe we could start. Not much. I don't think a bio is really necessary, but just a couple of words about. Um, your own experience in international politics and the Islamic world. Um, what brings you to this conversation in terms of your own experience?
So I came back from Saudi Arabia. I was there for a conference and I performed the Umrah, which is the minor pilgrimage, kind of like a shorter version of the Hajj pilgrimage. I returned on Friday night, and the next morning, by the time I'd woken up, the war had started, or I should say, the ongoing war had escalated dramatically. And I think, like a lot of other people, I responded with a combination of deep dismay, shock, even outrage at what was happening, as well as a more intimate sense of concern because Iran is a subject that I've been focused on for a very long time. Academically, for sure, but also in terms of policy spaces. So, way back when I lived in the Northeast and I was in policy spaces in New York City and Washington, D.C., the Iran deal was something that I worked on. That, if for those who remember, maybe don't remember, the Obama administration negotiated a pretty tight set of controls on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for some sanctions relief and bringing Iran back into the global economy. That deal was subsequently torn up by Trump, part of the conversation that seems to be going missing in a lot of spaces these days. And of course, broadcast to the Iranians that any agreement they reached with us was not to be relied on, and not only the Iranians, unfortunately. So I felt both the natural sense of what in the hell is going on, and why did we do this, and why is no one asking harder questions. So I hope we ask hard questions here, but also I know how badly this can go in a way that maybe others who aren't familiar with the topic might not realize. And the pivot point that I'll take is that the first day, Saturday, I think I just felt really down. And everyone
Mm-hmm.
I talked to, very much like you were saying, people were just really overwhelmed at what was happening.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me, like, I know these things in a certain way. This is an area of the world that I focused on for a long time. I have a responsibility now. And so actually I reached out to the high school students I teach and said, hey, who would be down to have a conversation, just background? What's happening in Iran? What's the nature of that regime? What might we want to do about this? How do we think about this? What are our moral obligations, civic obligations? All these really important questions. And maybe not to my surprise, but it was deeply meaningful all the same that they all pretty much said they wanted to do it, and even parents
Yeah.
jumped in and said they'd like to join.
Yeah.
And when I walked away from that conversation this weekend, I felt a sense of I won't say hope, but a sense of direction and purpose that I'm not the only one who's feeling this way. Actually, I think a strong majority of Americans oppose this war. Whether you're Republican or Democrat doesn't make any sense. And the question really is how do we move forward from here, uh, fully acknowledging how bad this is, but without allowing that to take us to a place where we shut down and refuse to not refuse to, or maybe find ourselves unable to move forward.
So I think most people will come into this conversation with some preconceived notion about what happened, about some allegiances or convictions around what should or shouldn't have happened. But could you just sort of let's set the baseline for a second? Like, give us a brief. I know it's always a danger to oversimplify things, but give us a brief kind of description about maybe the conversation you had with these high schoolers and their parents. What did happen? what is the context for the regime? Give us a little bit of a scene setting.
Sure. So, what I try to do in my classes, and what I think is a really helpful approach, and for those out there who are planning to vote in upcoming elections, it's to ask really good questions and to see if politicians are actually able to answer those questions.
Mm,
And so, the questions that I asked the students were really in two buckets. The first were, what do we know about Shia Islam? What do we know about Iran? What do we know about the contemporary Iranian regime? And so we spent a good chunk of time on that, right? The background, the history. And that's important because it is very important for people to realize this war did not start this weekend. The
yeah.
conflict with the United States and Iran didn't even start in 1979. It goes back many decades. In a sense, we inherited uncritically uh, and I think foolishly the role of the British Empire in the region, and we basically allowed ourselves to become the hegemon. We've conflated our interests with Israel's to the extent that many people, perceptive analysts, ask whether we're being led by Israel or Israel is being led by us. It's not really clear, which is itself deeply alarming and worrying as a whole set of other concerns. And then the question is, what is the necessary response to this moment? What do we do about it? How did we get into this situation? How might this unfold? And that requires, I think, puncturing a lot of assumptions. So we hear people say, on the one hand, that Iran is an existential or imminent threat to the United States. That's laughable. We eliminated the senior leadership of that country without hesitation and without any apparent difficulty. A country whose senior leadership can be eliminated without difficulty, without friction, right, is not a country that poses a threat. That doesn't mean that the Iranian regime isn't an odious and problematic regime,
Mm,
but it's also important to put things into perspective, right? Um, if Iran is not a threat, then why are we going to war with Iran? And
mm,
perversely and paradoxically, and I think this is the part that is missing from most conversations, is that by attacking a country that is not really a significant military threat to the United States, you can turn it into a different kind of threat by destabilizing the region, collapsing its government, alienating allies, emboldening other enemies. The question I always ask the students is just generally, when you choose a course of action, you are automatically excluding other courses of action. So if we put immense wealth, resources, moral, and strategic capital into this fight, we are automatically withdrawing from other commitments, right? Because we, as powerful as we are, we can't do everything all at once, right? So what are we sacrificing in the process? Why is it that we say we don't have money for X, Y, or Z, but
mm,
then somehow we have money for this? And if this isn't a strategic threat, if this is not something that can't be contained, and I think the Iran deal was more than capable of containing Iran's nuclear ambitions, then what are we really doing here? And
mm.
that's where the conversation gets really interesting. And I think that's what a lot of our fellow Americans are feeling. They might not be able to articulate it, but they understand it, right?
Yeah.
How's a country on the other side of the world suffering from decades of sanctions, who has alienated its own people, who has lost some of its best and brightest, that is basically subjected to whatever Israel wants to do, and Israel is not a power on the order we are, then something that we as a country should dedicate, I mean, the foreseeable future in terms of our military assets and diplomatic relationships too.
Yeah. I want to get to, so how do we respond, especially as faith communities? But before we go there, one of the refrains I've been seeing in the news on social media, even by our administration, is that Iranians are in the street celebrating the decapitation of the Iranian state, the removal of the Ayatollah. Um, Tell me, I mean, from my experience, I've seen people in the street celebrating similar kind of removals of heads of state, whether it's in Iraq with Saddam or it's Assad in Syria, or, I think there's probably maybe something happening potentially in Cuba right now, right? So, but it's hard to parse it out for people who aren't super intimately familiar with what's going on in Iran, how that can be true, and also all the things that you're saying is true are true as well. So just respond to that a little bit for me.
So the Iranian regime is not a particularly popular regime, and with good reason. So basically, for those who don't know, the Iranian regime was formed in 1979 after the fall of the Shah. So from basically for most of the 20th century, the Iran as a country previously called Persia, from 1935 on, I believe it's Iran, was ruled by the Pahlavi dynasty, really a father and son. They were absolute monarchs. They presided over police states. From 1953, when the CIA and MI6 basically jointly sponsored, launched, and supported a coup against a popular elected government over the question of nationalizing oil. Iran was under the rule of an increasingly autocratic, corrupt, westernizing Shah. And so, in the minds of many Iranians, the United States and, by association, Israel were connected to the suppression of their country. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the Shah's rule eventually collapsed in the 1970s. He wasn't just a deeply corrupt and unpopular ruler and a particularly ineffective one, but he went to war with Iranian culture and religion. And so he kind of did everything he could to alienate as many people as possible. The revolution, although Ayatollah Khomeini was the kind of figurehead of the revolution, and he was the most prominent leader of the revolution, he was by no means the only leader. You had everyone from liberals, social democrats, secularists, just kind of hardcore nationalists, communists. It was a broad popular movement aimed at removing the Shah. When the Shah was removed, over a few years, Khomeini and a certain kind of Islamist faction consolidated control. Now, part of the reason for that was that the U.S. got involved in a way that Khomeini was able to use or respond to galvanize his own supporters and to, there's a lot there. But the point is that the regime basically elected not to represent the majority of Iranians. The Iranian
Mm-hmm.
system is a European style democracy, on top of which there are a number of innovative, and I don't necessarily mean that in a good way, clerical bodies and checks and balances that prevent democracy from straying too far from boundaries that are set in place by a number of religious authorities. There's never been anything like this in the history of the Muslim world. Even the idea of an Islamic Republic is a pretty novel concept, but unlike the Islamic Republic of Pakistan next door, again, there's top-down clerical control. So it's not the case that there are no democratic features, but it's also not the case that this is a simplistic police state in the sense that it's not simply one-man rule. Because of the nature of the system, there are multiple sources of authority and poles of authority. What does that have to do with what we saw in the streets? A
Mm-hmm.
lot of Iranians do not like the regime,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that their interests will be served by our attacking the regime. And it doesn't mean that our attacking the regime is motivated by any concern for their welfare, right? There are lots of ways we could have improved the situation for Iranians, right? Tearing up a nuclear agreement that we ourselves pushed for indicates to the regime that we can't be trusted, which made it practically impossible to have any kind of diplomatic resolution. And I mean, a lot of these are just, again, like simple questions that for some reason a lot of journalists aren't asking. That
Mm-hmm.
if you overthrow a government, how can you possibly guarantee that another government will take its place? If you break down lines of communication, even if the regime is massively unpopular, that doesn't mean there's a coherent opposition or a single point of agreement on what comes next. You could have 10 governments. You could have 20 governments. You could have one government that is even more oppressive. You could have no government at all. And those aren't necessarily better scenarios. What
Mm-hmm.
happened in Iraq after our invasion was just horrific civil war followed by the rise of ISIS. And so tens of thousands of Iraqis had to die. And so if someone says Saddam Hussein was an odious leader, he should have been removed, is there no way to improve a government without killing tens of thousands of people? And also, why is that our business, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If we're actually motivated by the condition of people in the world under oppressive governments, the first place to start is with the governments that we are ourselves supporting that are oppressive,
Mm-hmm.
right? If we're
Mm-hmm.
really concerned about people not having the democratic franchise, there's a lot of places in the Middle East where we're backing governments that do not allow their citizens any kind of free expression, to say
Mm-hmm.
nothing of what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank and Palestine. So there's a lot of messages that people will point to without taking them to their logical conclusion.
Yeah.
Are the people who are currently advocating for this war really interested in Iranian welfare? And if they were, is this the way that we would find a better outcome for Iran? And finally, for us as Americans, it's one thing to say that our country shouldn't be actively involved in the oppression of other people. It doesn't mean our country's role in the world is to go fix other people's problems.
Yeah, I think for me personally, the rationale I'm hearing from the administration is both so convoluted and completely unbelievable. Whether sometimes it's about nuclear weapons, sometimes it's about supporting a popular uprising, sometimes it's about an existential. I mean, like we're just hearing all of these different things, and what does seem apparent in the midst of all this is there's not really a plan for what's coming next. It doesn't seem like those basic questions were asked. And so, in your perspective, what do you think at its core was the motivation for this attack that seems to be it seems difficult for the administration to have a succinct or coherent rationale for why they did what they did.
Operation Epic Distraction. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, that is a very important question, and I don't mean to dismiss it with my response, but I almost think that at this point we'll never know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if it makes a difference in terms of how it affects us as Americans, right? We can
Yeah.
look at
Yeah.
tariffs. The whole tariff thing made absolutely zero sense.
Yeah.
We had one number, then another number, then another number. We were told there were big investments being made. There's no such investments. Like none of this made any sense, right? I mean, as a simple point, there is absolutely no plan. There is probably no feeling that there even needs to be a plan, and that I think is the hardest thing to hear.
Mm-hmm.
But just think about this logically. Had we supported a transition, for example, let's say to electric cars, we could have moved away from wars for oil. Is it surprising that we're having a war over oil at the same time that we as a country are moving away from technologies the rest of the world are embracing? I think that there's actually a moral lens here, right? So in the Muslim tradition, and I'd love to hear how it works out in the Christian tradition, we believe that God sees people through their intentions, not through their outcomes, because we can't
Mm-hmm.
guarantee an outcome, right? My intention
Mm-hmm.
might really be I might dedicate 30 years of my life to Alzheimer's research and fail. But my intention might have been a noble one, and if the intention is noble, that's what God sees. A person might try to help someone, be unable to help them. They really want to do something to fix a problem. But we as human beings, we have no access to each other's interior lives beyond what people
Mm-hmm.
choose to share, right? Nor should we. And so all we can really do is judge outcomes. And in this case, I think there's a lot of outcomes that need to be judged.
Mm-hmm.
We have realized the situation in a matter of days where we have indicated to the rest of the world that we are a profoundly unstable, unserious, and dangerous force. And that's embarrassing for us as Americans, and it's dangerous for us as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Even our regional allies, the Gulf Arabs, you can see this on Saudi Arabian news, which is not exactly a free media market, right? You have Saudi analysts saying, we've just learned that when it comes to our security, the United States puts us well behind Israel. Despite all the money we've promised, all the relationships we've built, we don't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that says nothing of, I mean, how do you think people in Europe see this? Or people in Ukraine, or people in China and Taiwan and Japan? As powerful as we are, we can't keep doing this and expect that it doesn't have consequences. When the governments of countries like Greenland or Denmark, which kind of rules over Greenland in a certain way, when they see how we're acting now, how do you think they're going to process threats to Greenland in the future?
Mm-hmm.
These go from being very abstract to being actually horrifying. And I think that to me is to your point is the biggest thing, is that when you don't have a plan, it's not just that you end up in a mess of your own making, it's that you create messes you couldn't even anticipate.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that fundamentally uncurious people are even capable of imagining how they've changed their own landscapes and rules of engagement and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So to circle back to this convening that you facilitated with these high schoolers and their family on Sunday, you used this word as you were coming out of that meeting, which was hope. Um, there's not a lot of hope that I'm hearing in your analysis or description of the situation, and so I would love to hear what about that interaction made you feel hopeful, or maybe from a more kind of macro lens, how could we feel hopeful in this moment?
Sure. And it is strange for me to say hope, but I think when I say hope, what I mean is where I was Saturday, and where a lot of us were on Saturday, I wasn't by Sunday. And that's for three reasons, and I hope I remember them as I spell them out. Otherwise, I'll just make up a new number and change them because that appears to be how we're having serious conversations these days. So the first is the last numbers I saw were 59% of Americans oppose this war.
Right.
In an environment where our media has generally failed to ask hard questions, where we have a fragmented media landscape, where we don't have a lot of reliable sources of information that understand what's happening and also care about us as a country enough to give us information that gives us paths forward. 59% is a huge number in a deeply polarizing country. That's a big deal. Now, the fact that policies can be enacted whereby 59% of the country oppose something and it doesn't make a difference, that speaks to a democratic deficit in the United States. And we've seen that time and again. And I think we've talked about it in the podcast too, from Israel Palestine to gun control to healthcare. More Americans want outcomes than government policies would lead you to believe. And that's actually something that the wider world would hopefully understand as well. The second point is that the young people in the room did not have an attitude of we're all doomed, it's hopeless. It was more of an attitude of, okay, how do we talk about this? What does this mean for us politically? A number of these folks will be 18
Yeah.
within the next few months. They're going to be voting for the first time, so they're thinking about and paying attention to, for example, local Ohio politicians who suddenly lose their nerve, or actively sign up for something that their own constituents don't want and don't need. But the third thing is one of the realities that dismayed me about this moment is that people tended to look at what was happening in our country in a piecemeal fashion.
Hmm.
So we heard Democrats talking a lot about affordability as a way to push back against what's happening. And I'm not knocking that, but I think a lot of our problems are interrelated.
Hmm.
And domestic and foreign policy are related.
Hmm.
When Mamdani was running, my first reaction was a mix of enthusiasm and caution because on certain policies, I didn't know how I felt about his policies, right? Is freezing the rent actually going to lower rent? Wouldn't just create a new problem? We need more housing. We don't need to lower prices artificially or top down. We need to just increase supply. And again, like those are important conversations to have. But the underlying impulse got me excited that here's someone who wants to fix things. But then there's something when I talk to young people, actually, because I figured I don't get where Mamdani's coming from. Why don't I talk to students, high school students, college students? Why do you like him? And maybe that'll clue me into something that I don't understand. And they kept pointing something out. They said, we keep hearing that there's no money, that we don't have money for healthcare, we don't have money for infrastructure, we don't have money for technological innovation, research. There's just no money. But then when the elites need money, suddenly there's all the money in the world. So either there is money or there isn't money, right? We're not in a situation where two completely contradictory things can be true.
Hmm.
And the point they made is, well, if we're going into deficit, wouldn't it be better to go into a deficit for things that in the long term bring benefit to the United States? And I
Hmm.
actually use this example with some of the students that I think if you add up the cost of the Iraq War, which was fought on false pretenses, thousands of Americans died, tens of thousands of Americans, I think 20,000 Americans were injured, some of them very severely. We spent on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars for nothing.
Hmm. Hmm.
No one was held accountable. There was no meaningful attempt to say what went wrong, how did this happen, how do we prevent this from happening again. And that's hundreds of billions of dollars spent for what? Whereas if you spend hundreds of billions of dollars, let's say on improving American infrastructure or making healthcare affordable or vocational programs, I don't know, just cutting people a check, whatever it might be, that's more likely to bring about long-term good than hundreds of billions of dollars sunk into a war. And so that's where I come back to, is that they made that point. And I think that's something more and more Americans get. And I hear that too, that I've been following a lot of media responses on the right and the left, is how much is this costing? And what does this have to do with us as Americans? We're not even fixing a problem that we created where we can say we have some moral obligation.
Hmm.
We had realized the situation where we had contained the worst impulses, not all of them, of a pretty bad regime. Um, so what are we doing? And at the same time, if it is really about morality, then why is this the issue and not Gaza, for example, right? Why is the issue here and not censorship, authoritarianism, oppression in other Middle Eastern countries, right? Why this country? Why now? and how come this is possible when so many other things that Americans actually need are not possible. And I think that's where, I don't know if I'd call that hope, but
I would
it,
not call that hope. Yeah,
but in the sense that once people articulate that in a democracy on a mass scale, that
uh-huh.
means you have an opening. Now we need the politicians to come forward, the ideas to come forward, the people to mobilize in such ways that bring about the conversations that carry this forward. And I'm not advocating for specific solutions. That's not really my business, right? If I were running for office, then I would have to, but I'm not. So whether you take a more right wing approach, left wing approach, that's different. But the underlying moral impulse, right? America is for Americans first, right? And that we have a responsibility to ourselves, to each other, to look after each other. And our own national security depends on people who put our country's interests first in such a way that they can articulate and explain to the public, right? They work for us, not the other way around.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I'm outing you here, but we were texting about what was going on the morning after everything started, and the way that you responded was, "I think I'm done with politics." So this was before your meeting with with the kids from your halakha and their parents. But it sounds like you've kind of come around to say maybe I'm not completely finished with politics. Maybe there still is a glimmer of possibility of hope here. Is that true? I mean, are you finished with politics, or do you think there's still an avenue here for improvement, for well being, for some moral voice to kind of emerge?
So yeah, I think a lot of that obviously came out of the shock of what I was reading and seeing. But I am done with a certain kind of politics. I'm done with a politics of spinelessness, right? Um, and this actually does not have to do with left or right per se. But
Mm-hmm.
I am looking for politicians who take our system of government seriously and take our country seriously and take the American people seriously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If, for example, there were a local politician here in Ohio who purports to oppose Trump and then makes a qualified argument for why this war is necessary, I'd throw it back to that person. I'd say,
Mm-hmm.
prove to me that your logic isn't racist. Because if you say that we should punish Iran for crimes against its people, for people in the region, then why is not the same standard being applied to Israel? Why is Israel not being sanctioned? And the only logic that comes up in my mind is that the motivating logic is racist. Some kinds of people's lives matter less than others. And if a politician is applying that logic in foreign policy, that means they believe it themselves. And if they believe it themselves, then it's only a matter of time before that affects how they govern us as Americans. Our foreign policy should not betray core American values, right? We can have a conversation about immigration, right? In a democratic society, we have to have conversations like this. And we are not going to necessarily agree. Some people want more, some people want less. It's something that can and should be debated, right? It's a democracy. There's nothing per se that's off limits, right? But where I get activated is not where someone says, "Hey, we should be more thoughtful about immigration, or maybe we need certain kinds of immigrants more than others. We need certain industries, whatever it might be." If the underlying logic is a logic of morality and national interest, I'm happy to have that conversation. Because the underlying logic is some people are more American than others because of race, color, or religion, then that means that you are projecting out values that you yourself believe should be applied internally.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
can't accept that, right? And so I think where I'm done is that I'm done with the kind of, I don't know what it is, but it's a lack of moral conviction or just openly celebrating the decay and decline of our core values. In a moment like this, the response is not to call a hearing. The response is to call out what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
either we have money or we don't. Either Iran is a threat or it's not. If Iran was this big of a threat to the United States, why didn't we activate NATO? If Iran's nuclear weapons program was seen by the whole world as a threat, then we could have got the whole world on board. We could have saved American lives. We could have saved a lot of money. We could have done this in a way that would have been more reliable, right, and more effective for decades to come. And if you can't do that, then what does that say? What does that mean? And I think that's where I'm just tired of
Hmm.
that kind of approach. And I really think that we need, in faith communities, in ethical spaces, in policy conversations, in media, people who are able to articulate questions and keep pushing on those questions.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and if we can't get answers, then what do we do with that? And if we can't find politicians, or among existing politicians, people who are capable of asking those questions, then we need new voices, new faces.
yeah. I hear you. I think when I'm looking at this situation in particular, and the last year or more, if I'm being totally honest, I think about our conversation with Shadi about the need for a moral voice, and I have a hard time looking at our politics, especially our geopolitics, and thinking that anything is motivating us, um, apart from multinational corporations and people with a lot of money who are driving different outcomes. I don't think morality has a lot to do with the calculus of what's going on. All of that seems to be pretense and justification for what is the real motivation, whatever it is. It's hard for me. I think sometimes, um, I think within the American system we have some values that we can use to appeal to help to return us back to our better angels. That when I'm in the best headspaces, I feel like there's still some potential, there's still some hope here. But it feels like our political system, especially in moments like this, are being incentivized by something well outside any type of moral claim or moral consciousness. And so I think there is a role for faith communities to call people back to that higher aspiration. And if I'm being totally honest, I'm not sure if it's going to be futile or if it's going to be successful. Um,
What do you think the role for faith communities is then?
well, I think we have to. I don't think we have a choice. I don't know if it's about to go back to outcomes, intentions and outcomes. I don't know if it matters what the I don't know if the outcome matters in terms of determining what the role for faith communities is. I think we have to do that. Um, but sometimes when you see something like this happen, it's hard not to get to the point where you're saying, will that even matter? Does that even factor in to the decision makers and how they're making these decisions and what's driving them? Um, so that's where my head's at. That when I'm feeling hopeless, that's where I'm going. Um, what then to do? Well, I think what we do is we still operate off of things like the fruits of the spirit, love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness. I mean, like, that's the stuff that we're appealing to. And I think the faith claim is that has the potential to change our systems, our institutions, our communities, our neighborhoods, our relationships for the better. Um, but sometimes it feels like the institutions are beyond repair. So tell me how I shouldn't give in to that despair, Haroon, especially in this moment.
So I'll take it back to the class on Sunday, and the students, again, they're young, so they don't have the broader context of history. And I talked to them about decisions that were made by people in Iran over decades and what those decisions led to, right? Because there is a temptation in this moment that, and I had it myself. I saw it myself on Saturday morning. I just wanted to check out. I wanted to disappear.
Yeah,
I didn't
totally.
want to have these conversations anymore. And then I realized it took me the better part of a day, but when you're knocked sideways by world events, sometimes you need some time to recover. And so what I said is that when Khomeini came to power in 1979, actually I think it was early around January, February. These are key dates in the revolution, 1979. He had choices before him,
Hmm.
and he could have tried to find a way to work with different factions and interest groups in Iran. Now, obviously, in the context of the U.S. and the West's role in the region, that was very hard, given his own ideological restrictions and his intellectual limitations, and I would argue his spiritual failings. He was not able to conceive of a way to build an Iran that was actually representative of Iranians. If
Mm.
we think, I mean, a helpful way to think about it is the United States as a country, right? We are the product of compromise. And when people say things, well, why does Wyoming get two senators, but so does California? And I said, well, we wouldn't have had a country otherwise. And
Mm-hmm.
you can poo-poo it, but in the moment, compromises are necessary to create institutions, countries, what have you, right? And they can come in retrospect to feel frustrating, but what is the alternative? And what I was trying to explain to them was not that any of them are in a situation where they're coming to power or anything like that, right? But how you approach the world matters. And in a
Mm-hmm.
moment where you feel like people's lives don't matter because they share your religion or your ethnic ancestry, it's really important to remember that you can't allow that to then color how you move through the world.
Yeah.
And obviously beyond what is necessary to take care of yourself and look after yourself, right? You have to stand for principle, but acknowledge that people say things like speak truth to power. Actually, the way to constrain power is by building power, right? And building relationships and creating connections and empowering each other in ways that restrain our worst tendencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Grossly economically unequal societies do not maintain democratic features because you really can't, right? So these are things we need to know. And I think religion teaches this, right? You shouldn't
Sure.
have everything you want, even if you can. It's bad for you. It's bad for
Mm-hmm.
us individually, it's bad for us collectively. And religion did play a big role in the founding of the US. And actually a lot of political Islamist groups made this mistake to their detriment, right? And that's the failure of the ideology. When the Muslim Brotherhood came to power in Egypt, they could have built a government that represented a cross section of Egyptians, Christians and Muslims, more religious, less religious, left wing, right wing. They could have created a far more, it would have moved really slowly and been really cumbersome, but everybody would have had a stake,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't do that. And that doesn't justify what happened. Obviously, I'm not saying that therefore the government should be overthrown, but that's sort of an own goal. And what I was trying to leave the students with was, from here going forward, I don't want you to ever conclude that the right way to do something is by turning in on yourself. That
Mm.
actually, to your point, I think what we saw, the failure of the Democratic Party in recent years, is that too many leading Democrats don't actually stand for anything.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't, neither Biden nor Harris seem to be able to articulate a red line. If someone can't articulate what they are willing to lose an election for, they don't actually believe in anything, right? If
Mm-hmm.
Harris says something like, oh, if I say this, I'll lose, I won't win the election. Okay. You have to have something, right? Like there has to be something in your moral framework that is a red line, right? If I have incontrovertible evidence that civilians are being targeted, that children are being targeted with weapons we are selling this country, that's a red line for me. I'm not going to sell those weapons. And
Mm-hmm.
and maybe that loses you an election in the short term, but in the long term, it is necessary for the country, it's necessary for your own soul, and it's necessary for the functioning of democracy, right?
Yeah.
That we need people of principle. And so actually I would say that this is what I think faith communities need to do, is to create people who balance principles with engagement with the world, that are able to have thoughtful conversations about when do we sit down in the room and when do we step out of the room. And we might not always agree, but it is really important to understand that both of those things are necessary. We have to be able to work with our fellow Americans without losing sight of what we stand for. And actually, I think that's the whole point of a democracy. So we can work together without having to check our beliefs at the door.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the way, I
No,
think
no,
that's
no. Yeah, no, I like that. I think the thing that for me that resonates with your answer is the emphasis on time horizons, right?
yeah,
And I think what that implies is the role of faith communities is to assert that these morals, these values, actually will serve the betterment of our society, of our communities, of our country. And that maybe in this individual moment, it will seem as if the forces of evil and selfishness and corruption will win out. Um, but in the long haul, I mean, this is the moral arc of the universe, right? I think that's a faith claim. It's not a purely rational claim. Um, I also think that the tension is not something that's going to be resolved. It maybe shouldn't be resolved. Because because like appealing to long time horizons in this moment feels insufficient, because we want to have a lever to pull in this moment that will change things right now for the better for the people who are suffering or who will suffer in these next couple of weeks as the bombardment seems to continue. And so maybe the resolution of this tension isn't something we should be looking for. Maybe a part of the life of faith is also to agree to sit in this tension, but for us to have these conversations and to not let us slip into places of despair, let one another slip into places of despair where we think any action that we take won't be worth it. Is that enough? Probably not, but it's something. It's something.
Yeah, it's not enough, but I think it's more than people realize, because I think even when we have the conversation, we give people permission to say that they might be feeling the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if the initial response is to turn inward and collapse in on oneself, as I kind of did on Saturday for
It
for a
seems
few
like
hours
I'm
there,
doing right now. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
and I understand that, because it is unlikely we are going to stop this in the near term. We don't know, right? Enough pressure and things can change, but we don't know. But even the act of speaking out and articulating responses is deeply meaningful and necessary, and then it inevitably leads to further decisions and actions, whether that's teaching a class, empowering people with more information, reaching out to, let's say, a politician or an institution, reaching out to neighbors who might be suffering directly or indirectly, whatever it might be. And those actions have chain effects. I don't know what the term there is, but and I think that there is obviously reason to be really down, but there's also reason to believe that through that and with that, we are able to articulate what we actually stand for.
Hmm.
And again, we didn't stop the genocide in Gaza, and that is something I feel I will have to answer for, we will have to answer for, right? But we've also seen a sea change in American opinion.
Hmm.
And is that enough? No. But it is hard to believe that that change will not affect policies in years to come.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if we can use this moment to talk about not only why we shouldn't be at war, but what our Constitution demands and what our system of government requires, I think it's actually fittingly enough in the 250th anniversary of the United States, the conversation we should be having. Why do we have a country? Why does the executive have to go to Congress? Why are we supposed to have checks and balances? Is this country worth fighting for or not? And one of the amazing things about the country is that we can come to a positive conclusion and say yes from different faith traditions. And
Hmm.
we don't have to check those faith traditions at the door.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Well, Haroon, thanks for being my friend, the friend that I go to when I'm trying to
Thank you.
work through my own despair. And the friend that I know will sometimes share that despair, but won't stay there. So thanks for being that person in my life. Um, and I'm sure the conversation will continue. I hope the conversation around this particular war will end very soon. I think that's something we're all praying for, but
Sure.
at this point, it doesn't seem like that's super likely. So um,
Yeah. We have to keep going.
we have to keep going. Yes, indeed. All right, Haroon.
Thank you,
Talk
man.
again. Talk soon.
Yeah.
Bye.